I was sure we wouldn't die in prison. I thought apartheid was living on borrowed time. When we started our armed struggle, our manifesto said that we will eventually take power, but better to negotiate a political solution to the issue of equal rights for all. When you're ready to negotiate, we'll also be ready. From then until talks started took nearly 30 years. I started school on my 6th birthday, 11th of April 1939. Mum and Dad said I was going to be under attack because they were communists, they were non-racists, we had people of all colours visiting our home, and some of my teachers and classmates were going to pick on me. And also, because that was the 1930s, pre-World War II, anti-Semitism was rife. I would be called Jew boy. They said, just do the best you can at school. You don't have to be top of your class. Just do the best you can. Then nobody can attack you for being a this or a that or the other because of their bias and prejudice. Miss Cook was my first teacher. She was young and beautiful. I can still see her page boy haircut and smell her wonderful perfume. Age 6, I fell instantly in love. At morning break, we all went out to the schoolyard for our sandwich and a cup of milk. One day, when we got back inside, Miss Cook was really unhappy. Her golden wristwatch had been stolen from the drawer of her desk. Who took it, she asked. With one voice, 30 kids, 6 years old, cried out, Nolan took it, Miss Cook. Nolan had a hair lip and a cleft palate, and he spoke funny. 6-year-old boys can be terribly cruel. Miss Cook said, how do you know it was Nolan? We saw him, Miss Cook. But how could we have seen him? We were all outside. She cross-examined us, trying to get us to really understand what we were saying. She called me up, and I stood next to her, and she put her arm around me. Being so close to Miss Cook was embarrassing. My face was flaming red, but it was lekker too. She led me to understand that I was blaming Nolan because he was different. Because of his hair lip, we had made him an outcast. We treated him terribly. I'm ashamed of it now. But what a lesson she gave us about prejudice and injustice. My dear Miss Cook, I loved you so, and I think you had a hand in sending me to prison, because I had to uphold this belief that prejudice is wrong. On May 8, 1963, the 90-day Detention Act, detention without trial, was to come into effect. Its purpose was to extract information for the security police about the armed struggle. We said it was a license to torture. My comrades in Cape Town were insistent that I would be among the first arrested. Not that the police knew I was involved in Umkhonto we Sizwe, but when it came to loudspeaker systems and printing and preparing pamphlets and posters and silk screening, I was the guy my comrades called Mr. Technico, the one who taught everybody else. They said, "You're going to get at least 10 years, Dennis. Better leave, go overseas, get trained, come back with a new personality, new documentation." Some comrades even had the cheek to suggest plastic surgery to make me handsome. But you don't just leave, you have to be disciplined and so report to the next higher level of your organization, which was our high command in Johannesburg. There I met our top leaders, who asked me to stay to prepare the weapons for a major uprising, Operation Maibuya. Leaving my wife Esme and the kids was complicated. Daughter Hilary was 8 years old and David was 6. Hilly woke up when I embraced her to say goodbye. David was half awake, but he didn't know what was going on. I just disappeared out of their lives. I didn't know what would happen. I couldn't tell Esme where I was going, who I was going with, how I was going, because I had to protect her and me and all of us. I simply said I was going overseas. I would send for her when I could. I didn't really hold Esme and the kids in my arms again until David was 28 and Hilly was 30 years old. I was unavoidably detained for 22 years. Lux Martin Goodlay was a remarkable young man. He was literate but floated from one menial job to another. He repaired shoes over the weekend while a group of young men gathered around him. He would read them the news and explain it. He was an absolutely natural leader. When we organized the first Umkhonto we Sizwe training camp at Mamre, I was made the camp commander, the comrade commandant. I thought Luxmart should command. He spoke all our languages, and because I couldn't go into a township without sticking out like a sore thumb, he had to be the commander. He had an absolute natural authority. He'd never done military training himself, but in no time he had our 30 recruits working as a military unit, absolutely disciplined and enthusiastic. Whatever task they had to do, it was, "Yes, Sergeant. Yes, Sergeant. We'll do it, Sergeant." These young men in later years developed a tremendous reputation in Umkhonto we Sizwe actions and in the ANC as political leaders, and I'm immensely proud of their achievements. But Luxmart played an important role in all our lives. Luxmart was the first to be tortured to death during 90-day interrogation in 1963. My interrogators threatened me with the same end unless I gave them information. Because they wanted me unmarked on trial, together with Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and others, my torture was not physical but psychological, with a constant threat of death throughout 3 months of interrogation. Many years later, in 2013, I was present when Luxmart's remains were exhumed in a cemetery in Mamelodi in Tshwane, as Pretoria is now called. International experts in identifying human remains were there. DNA tests were done, and some 4 months later, Luxmart's remains were handed over to his family in a beautiful coffin at a simple but moving ceremony. Again, I sat with the family. Luxmart's parents were old and shaken by the experience. His son, who was the spitting image of his tata, was 6 years old when he was murdered. As an adult, he spent 30 years pushing the government to find out what had happened. Closure at last, after 50 years. Freedom costs, you know. Our 90-day detention came to its end. We were charged under the Sabotage Act, which carried with it the possibility of the death penalty. There were 11 of us on trial, and the hype was incredible. The media in South Africa at the time had been screaming for the death penalty. We were obviously guilty. The government said so. The evidence was there, and they wanted us hanged. The state's case against us was very strong. They had an advantage because alone in all our laws, if a case could be made, you had to prove your innocence. The idea of innocent until proven guilty was thrown out the window to make it easy for the prosecution. Lots of documents were captured, including some of mine about weapons manufacture, notes from Nelson Mandela about his political and military studies, and diary entries about people he had met. There were also organizational things kept by Governor Mbeki and Walter Sisulu. This was reinforced by a large number of our comrades who had been broken under 90 days detention and who were brought to give oral evidence against us. Right from the beginning, we said we were not going to deny the charge of a conspiracy to overthrow the state by force of arms. Our defense had to be political. Apartheid's lack of democracy, its exclusion of the majority of people from the official political life of the country, and its brutality demanded that we overthrow the system. Nelson Mandela opened our defense with a speech from the dock. It lasted for nearly 4 hours, ending with a powerful declaration that all his life he'd fought against white domination and he'd fought against black domination. His ideal, he said, was a society where we could live together, black and white, in peace and harmony, and it was an ideal he hoped to live to see achieved. And then the famous words, But, my lord, if it needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. What I remember is the silence left hanging at the end of this challenge. It wasn't shouted, it was just said with tremendous conviction and determination. The trial went on, and some of us gave evidence. Walter Sisulu was an intellectual giant in our liberation movement, led by the African National Congress, and Dr. Utah, the only prosecutor with a doctorate in the law, thought he was superior. Walter turned him inside out intellectually, a real tour de force of calm explanation and utter conviction against the facile remarks of a ratist. Miss Cook would have sorted him out. I gave evidence, not that I could really talk myself free, though there was a tiny little loophole. More important was that I could explain why I'd been involved. As a privileged white, I would be responsible for that system unless I acted against the regime that made me, a first-generation South African, so privileged. At the end of the trial, the judge found us guilty on 4 charges: conspiracy to overthrow the state, a plan to receive an army of invasion, and various other things. In my case, I'd bought another farm for us, and I'd bought a Volkswagen Combi with beautiful curtains to hide my great leaders. I, a white boy, 30 years old, suit, collar, tie, looking very respectable, could drive them around. The next day, the judge came in to read the verdict. There were pleas in mitigation which seemed to make the judge angry. Finally, the judge, very quietly, from a tiny slip of paper, said, "In a case tantamount to high treason, the appropriate sentence is the ultimate sentence, death." But it wasn't charged as high treason. We were charged under the Sabotage Act. Therefore, he could allow some leniency, but the only leniency in accordance with his duty to uphold law and order was life on all counts. I was 31 years old, and I was going to die in prison 4 times over. My mother couldn't hear, and she called out, "Dennis, Dennis, what is it?" And I said, "It's life, and life's wonderful." The cost in life, in suffering, in tragedy was appalling, but we were convinced we would survive. It was sad for me that Bram Fischer, our leading defence counsel, who said that he felt safe from arrest whilst he was leading the defence team in the Rivonia trial, was arrested 3 weeks afterwards. He eventually jumped bail and was rearrested after 9 months of underground activity, was sentenced to life imprisonment, and there my defence advocate joined me in prison. He died of cancer, still a prisoner. I think the medical care was inadequate. I nursed him. He was so frail by the end. I could pick him up and put him on a toilet, and pick him up and put him back in bed. What a tragedy. What a brilliant mind. What a passionate believer in equality and freedom. We were taken to the hanging prison in Pretoria. Because the security of our prison was being upgraded, they had to move us all out. They took us to the prison, known by the ordinary prisoners as Beverly Hills. This was really gallows humour. Our section of that prison, where we were kept totally alone, seeing no other prisoners, was very near the gallows. Every week, we would hear the carpenters working on the gallows, testing the trapdoors, and we would stay out of our exercise yard, which was right next to that building. Such a sickening sense of what was coming. And that evening, prisoners would start singing to comfort those who were going to be hanged, always on Thursday morning. They would sing hymns, and they would start and break off and start again until some 3,000 prisoners were singing together. Some of our comrades were on death row. They sang freedom songs, which all eventually joined in. I played the melodies on my recorder. It was the only way we could communicate, through the music. The singing would go on throughout the night, and the next morning we would hear the fall of the trapdoors. Usually 2 or 3 people were hanged every week, and the singing would stop as though a switch had been thrown. It was very stressful week after week, knowing people were going to die. And there was an occasion where obviously an African woman was being hanged. You could hear from her screams, a female voice, and the next day hearing ordinary white criminal prisoners talk about her with such contempt. Contemptuous word for a prisoner, a person who was going to die screaming in fear. And they made jokes about it. A couple of years ago, I was taken on a visit to that prison, and for the first time I saw the gallows room. It's now used, ironically, for dead files. There's no other place to store them. Burned out, alone, I lie, eat, sleep, Body meets calls, all within four walls. Months, years pass slowly when days seem long. Always the same, nothing done, nothing achieved. Thoughts focused only on oneself behind the walls. Far off, carried softly on the night wind, a clock strikes the hour. In the morning, the town rumbles. There, outside the walls, people live their lives. Factories' sirens call their workers. Diesel locomotives shunt and couplings clatter. Cars hoot and machines drone. Their beat, even muffled by the walls, saves me from doubt. But it isn't easy for thoughts to fly when body and mind are in a stall. But on the rising wind, my thoughts become sharp and focused. Take wing, take the right attitude, fly clear over the walls. Striving, joining in the contradictions of life out there to build anew and turn my defeat into victory. Chris Harney was a young man from Stellenbosch who had studied at Fort Hare and had been sent down for his political intransigence. He came back to Cape Town after the ANC had been declared illegal and revitalized an organization called the Youth League. He really was a dynamic leader, and then he went abroad to flee a sentence for continuing the work of the illegal ANC. He became a soldier, a great commander, was interned in Botswana, and was eventually released and continued in his role. And once our people could come home, when the negotiation phase started, he was out buying a newspaper one Sunday morning in 1993 and was assassinated in a drive-by shooting. The uproar in the country was enormous. He was tremendously popular, and his murder threatened an outbreak of indiscriminate, uncontrolled violence against whites. Nelson Mandela went on television to call for calm. He explained that such violence will leave a bitterness that will take too long to overcome. He said that we could not win a military conflict. The apartheid state with its international backers was far too strong. But we could win at the ballot box. We needed peace. We needed to move on to elections. And I have to say that President de Klerk, the last apartheid president, responded. He was compelled by this assassination and the wave of anger to set the date for the first free elections in April 1994. Chris Harney didn't die in vain, but he would have been a very powerful influence had he lived. We might have had a different outcome because he has the strength of personality that people listened to him. He called me his first commander, and I felt tremendously honored that he felt that way about me. Nelson Mandela had been released. He wasn't yet president, and he was having a Meet the Press day on Robben Island. I happened to arrive that morning in Cape Town and was hurried over to the island. It was the first time I'd seen the place, having been imprisoned in Pretoria. As I got off the ferry, a young man with dreadlocks, James Mange, came over to me and said, "Are you Comrade Goldberg?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "You're the comrade who played the penny whistle for us when we were on death row." And he said it gave him such hope and courage that I could communicate with them in this way. It touched me deeply. We were shown around the prison, and then we sat in a hall under the portraits of B.J. Forster and Verwoerd and the new Minister of Police and Prisons, Adrian Flock and F.W. de Klerk. Nelson Mandela was telling stories, and he did what I do. You tell stories about prison, about the absurdity of the petty power wielded by junior officials and senior ones. And to show that you're not broken by the experience, the story always has a little twist in the tale that leaves your audience on an upbeat note and a bit of a laugh. But there were experiences of petty power and people being emotionally traumatized by prison guards. We were asked to go for a walk in the limestone quarry where Nelson and all my other comrades had to work. And we were walking in a line, and I said, "Nell, sometimes when you tell your stories, you have to express anger. People were badly hurt. They don't have the opportunity to appear before the media and appear heroic. And sometimes you need to express anger on their behalf. Not all the time, just some anger. We cannot allow this to happen in the future, this petty exercise of power that does damage to our people." And then all the others chimed in, and they'd not been listening to me. Walter said it was okay, so it was okay. I have to say I always consulted Walter myself. But this time there was a misunderstanding about what I was saying. And then Nelson, a few months later, was sworn in as president. And he had this gift of finding the right words. "Remember, this is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. How more dramatic can you be?" Sworn in as president, he made his speech, in which just about his last words were, "Never, never, and never again shall we allow one to dominate over another as in the past. Let freedom reign." I felt vindicated. We cannot allow people to dominate over others through their prejudice, and our freedom has to ensure that it does not happen. I don't know if Nelson listened to me, but it was in keeping with the whole trend from roughly 1943, the African Claims document which called for equal rights in South Africa for all our people. And there was in 1994 still proclaiming this, absolutely convinced that it's the right thing. And there lies my hope for the future, such certainty about what's morally right.